for the next few weeks on the Gospel of James. I've entitled it, How Then Shall We Live? The book of James is written to the Jewish community, but it would have had Gentile believers as well. They met at house churches, and they were struggling, as we do, and as every generation of believers has, with how to integrate your faith, the teaching of Jesus, that relationship with him, into the way we live in a society which may run in very different directions on a number of issues. How then shall we live? I don't know if you've noticed, but when I go together with family gatherings or group gatherings, I find it much easier to relate to someone in my own peer group or age group. And you may find yourself saying, I don't understand how the other generations are thinking. Ever had that exposure? Generally, depending on your age range, there will be a peer group, and this is true in virtually every society. People grow up together, and I think it's because we adopt, probably from teenage years to early 20s, the predominant worldview. It's one of the major factors, along with our family and church and other influences. But the impact of the spirit of the age, or the worldview of the age in those formative years for each of us, seems to mold us and make us quite distinctive. And so you get Generation X, Generation Y, post-millennials, premillennials, all of those things, as ways of defining the different groups of people and how we connect. Now, why is this significant? Because it's always been so. Every generation adopts the worldview of the society in which you live. It means that, for example, different societies around the world have great difficulty understanding each other because their worldviews are actually quite different. They may look similar, and they're probably the most dangerous because we make assumptions because things look the same that surely that must be the case. I remember being greeted in northern Nigeria at a market by a houseman who came up to me and did this. Now, he didn't realize, but in my culture, when someone comes up to you and does this, it means something. And it's not a pleasant greeting. However, in Hausa society, this is a greeting of honor. He was greeting me in a traditional way. But of course, after I got over the initial shock, I got it. I wasn't running. And so we have these worldviews. It was true of the Christian community in James's time, to whom he's writing. And if you want to understand the book of James, you need to think about what are the worldview that they're struggling with, and then they run into Jesus and how inconvenient Jesus can be, because he changes the world upside down in so many different ways. And it makes it very uncomfortable to be a Christian, particularly when the worldview is very different or moving in very different directions. Sometimes there are contact points, but very often it can be quite different. So in James's time, the community he's writing to, they're part of the Roman Empire. Now, I got a sense of this because in late August, I climbed the upper part of Mount Vesuvius in my spare time for a good time. I was pondering it as I was 3/4 of the way up. This isn't such a good time that I was. But I got to the top, and you can look down from Mount Vesuvius and see a number of communities, modern-day communities, but there were at least 9 that were completely covered with pumice ash when Mount Vesuvius erupted in, I think, about 78 AD. And you look down from the top of the mountain, you see the lava flows, you think about the awesome power of this event and its implications. And then after getting down, I went to Pompeii, one of the 9 cities which was totally destroyed by the eruption. And within 30 hours, 33 feet of pumice ash had fallen, covering everything. And that's why, of course, it was preserved so well. But as they were excavating down, they found some interesting things. They know that at least of the population, 2,000 people died, at least, that they found. And they often find the bodies decayed. Maybe there's some bones, but the ash has preserved the outline. And so when they come across one of these, they inject it with plaster and get the plaster cast of the person or animal that was there. Now, they must have made some really interesting discoveries. So for one, in a number of places, they found hoards of treasure in a locked basement room of the houses. And on the first floor, guarding the door, in a number of cases, there were shapes of bodies. But no one else in the house. Archaeologists speculate those were the slaves that were forced to stay and guard the household treasure while everyone else hit the road in the middle of the eruption. And all that's left now is the shape to remind us of the inequality of that age. Of course, one of the things about the Roman Empire was there were Roman citizens who had legal rights, protection, status, and then there were slaves who were considered property with no value outside to their owner. They had very few rights. Persona non grata. That's the world in which James is writing to. And within Roman society, your dress actually dictated your status. So people would wear different types of dress to indicate their status within the society. So James is writing to a group of people who are very familiar with free and slave, male and female, ranking, economic poor, education levels, even where you came from. And those became the basis of discrimination and favoritism and distinction. And then comes Jesus. And the gospel says, in God's eyes, there's no male or female, slave or free, Jew or Gentile. All are equally loved in the eyes of God. And if you want to see the Roman Empire flipped upside down, and what eventually destroys slavery, I think, in that time period, is the fact that Christians kept preaching that whether you're slave or free, God has created you and you are loved equally. And as they gathered in these house fellowships, you would have slaves with technically their owners in the same communion. And then they would have these agape meals afterwards. So they'd have communion together, they'd have an agape meal after. And in the agape meal, people would tend to congregate with their social groups. So the rich would hang out with who? And the slaves would hang out with who? Now, if you're rich, you probably brought some really good Roman wines, and there's some very good Italian wines, if you know anything about Italian wines. And the poor had very little. And as James writes to the community, he observes what he sees when he goes to the house church, where some people are eating very well and other people are in the corner, literally cast aside because they're considered less than. But James reminds them that the gospel says that each of us is precious and loved in God's sight. Each of us is equal in God's sight. Each of us is called to share from our abundance with those in need and with compassion. One of the most difficult experiences I had on one visit to Kenya, to one of the slums or informal communities in Kenya, which has about 1 million people living in it, most of them in shacks, was to go to an Anglican school where 2/3 of the children were just going to the mess hall for lunch, and 1/3 of the children were sitting outside watching the other 2/3 eat. And as I watched this, I asked the principal quietly, I said, "What's this about?" And he said, "Well, unfortunately, the 1/3 of the children, their parents didn't have money to provide for their food. The other 2/3 did, and so we're able to feed them, but we don't have funds to cover the rest." So one of the things the group did was provide money at that time for 2 years' worth of food for everyone. It was a response to the gospel to those in need. And I think James, when he looked at the community, saw something similar to that happening. Those who are without and those who are with. I know that a number of you support World Vision or Compassion International and make a huge impact through your sponsorship of children, changing the lives of children and the people in the village. It's the call of the gospel that we don't own things, we're just entrusted with them and called to use them to glorify God. And when we do that, people see the difference. So when our mission team arrived in Thailand, we actually packed in about another 8 or 9 suitcases. We had donated toys for children, small blankets that had been made, and some clothing for children and adults. A number of those toys were designed to go to an Anglican chaplaincy at the cancer hospital where a number of children receive cancer treatment. And the chaplains will take a toy in, and many of the children who are there have virtually nothing. They come from the provinces, they're very poor. And so the Anglicans run a hostel for those families, and then they also visit the hospital and often bring toys. So one of the things we've been doing when we're going is taking suitcases of toys, usually stuffed animals that you can give to children. When we arrived at the hotel, the concierge of the hotel saw all the suitcases and thought we North Americans really pack heavily for visits to Thailand. Then I said, I hope you don't mind, but we're going to need a van, and I need to separate these suitcases away because we're taking them to be given as donations. The guy's jaw almost dropped because usually when people arrive at that hotel, they're there just for fun and for tourism, and nothing wrong with that. But the whole idea that a group of people would arrive with suitcases full of donations for children at the hospital was, for him, quite wonderful. Now, here's what he did. He's probably in the Buddhist tradition. He said, I am just amazed at this, and I really want to be supportive. So I actually am going to pay for the van for you to take this stuff to the place where it needs to go. And so he called his friend. His friend came up. We loaded the van with all the suitcases. But I thought to myself, people are looking for authentic witnesses to the gospel, of acts of love, when very often we open the newspaper and you read something quite different. And that's what James is saying to the Christian community. Your witness will be determined by the way you love one another and the way you love others. How then shall we live? As Jesus taught us, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, your mind, your soul, your strength, and to love as your. Amen.